Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take fascinating, often complex sources and really break them down, pulling out the essential insights for you. Our goal is simple: help you get genuinely well-informed, cut through all the noise without feeling like you're drowning in information. Today, we're jumping into a really significant topic. It's about the intricate world of modern Pan-Africanism. You see this image, right? A new wave of Pan-Africanist consciousness sort of sweeping across the continent. It sounds powerful. Lots of rhetoric about liberation, self-determination, historical justice, very resonant stuff. But our main source today, Christian Lee Sangola, points out something, well, troubling, a paradox lurking beneath the surface. And he warns this paradox could actually undermine the very empowerment that Pan-Africanism aims for. So that's our mission today: unpack this paradox. We want to move beyond the simple stories, get to a more sophisticated understanding of Africa's challenges, its opportunities. We'll be drawing heavily on Lisangola's work, which is great because it blends history, philosophy, economics, current events. We'll guide you through it.
Hopefully you'll have some of those aha moments, seeing how multifaceted responsibility really is when we talk about genuine African empowerment. Think of it as your shortcut to grasping a really crucial, often oversimplified global discussion.
It really is a crucial discussion. And what's so compelling about Lee Sangola's approach, I think, is how he challenges us. Challenges us to look beyond our first assumptions, maybe the easier ones. He's pushing us towards, well, let's be honest, a more uncomfortable truth sometimes. Asking us to spot the patterns, connect the dots. It takes some intellectual honesty. It's absolutely not about dismissing history. Those injustices are real, undeniable. But it's about adding these vital layers that often get missed, focusing as much on agency, on what can be done, as on the impact of external forces.
Right, and to really get a grip on this paradox, Lee Sangola starts us off somewhere incredibly stark. The immediate human reality of migration. We're talking thousands, tens of thousands of young Africans making a choice that's frankly hard to fathom for many of us. They decide that the possibility of dying at sea on these dangerous journeys is somehow better than staying home.
Okay.
Just pause on that for a second. The level of desperation it implies about the conditions they're leaving behind.
It's not just a number on a page, is it? It's a profound human cost. A crisis of hope, really. It reminds me of Dr. Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist and philosopher, his work on colonial psychology. Fanon observed that people naturally seek stability, security. It's fundamental. You only resort to extreme, life-threatening measures when circumstances become truly unbearable. So when people are willing to gamble their lives against the sea, it signals a total breakdown of that basic stability at home. It's a terrible indictment.
And Achille Mbembe, the Cameroonian philosopher, he adds another layer with this idea of necropolitics. It's quite a powerful concept. He talks about how power can sometimes be about controlling who lives and who dies, essentially. How this politics of death shapes existence. Mbembe puts it like this, and it's worth quoting: "The decision to migrate under such dangerous conditions represents a complex negotiation between different forms of death. The slow death of dreams and opportunities at home versus the immediate risk of physical death at sea." Wow.
That framing, negotiating between different forms of death, it's incredibly potent because it forces us right then and there to confront immediate, tangible failures. It pulls the conversation away from only focusing on distant colonial legacies, which, again, are real and have huge impact, no question. But it brings the spotlight right onto present-day governance, the actual conditions now within these African nations. It suggests the despair, the slow death of opportunity of a future is felt so intensely that it outweighs the immediate fear of drowning or violence. It's not just about poverty, it's about a fundamental lack of viable path forward in life.
Yeah, and this leads directly to one of Lisangola's most critical points, a distinction that really cuts against the grain of some common narratives. He's very clear. Those risking everything in the Mediterranean. They aren't fleeing direct Western exploitation in that immediate sense. They're not, say, running from a specific foreign company that just set up shop and ruined their farm, though that happens too, of course. Instead, Lisangola says they are fleeing, quote, the immediate reality of their home countries, the tangible, locally generated conditions that make such a desperate gamble seem preferable to staying.
That distinction is absolutely critical because it reframes how we need to think about this migration crisis and maybe Africa's broader development picture too. It forces us to shift our main focus not entirely away from external factors, but towards scrutinizing the proximate causes, the immediate drivers within these countries. It's not about letting external actors off the hook, historically or currently. It's about saying the trigger, the final push for these individuals often comes from failures closer to home, failures of governance, lack of opportunity, insecurity. These unbearable circumstances Fanon mentioned. What specific local things are creating that? This view doesn't ignore the global picture, but it demands we look at the local situation with just as much, if not more, urgency.
So, okay, if we really take that distinction seriously, what does it tell us about the root causes? And for you listening, what really jumps out at you about looking at it this way? It's challenging, right? Because it directs our attention towards where immediate internal change might actually be possible. It pushes us to ask not just who did this to us, but also what conditions are we creating or allowing right now? Now, let's move into what Lisangola calls the complexity of causation. This is where things get really interesting and maybe a bit uncomfortable, because the source is careful. It doesn't dismiss the historical context at all. In fact, it affirms it strongly. But then it pushes us further. It's vital to say upfront, modern Pan-Africanism isn't wrong. Not wrong to point to the devastating impact of colonialism, slavery, ongoing resource extraction. It's all well documented. Lisangola explicitly states, the evidence of external exploitation is undeniable and well documented.
Absolutely. That has to be the starting point. You look at somewhere like the Democratic Republic of Congo, incredibly rich in minerals, cobalt, things our phones need, and the mining there. It's fueled conflicts that have cost millions of lives. Resource wealth becoming a curse. That's undeniable. External interests definitely play a huge role in that tragedy. Lisangola acknowledges this without hesitation. Any serious look at Africa has to start there.
Right. That history, that ongoing external pressure, it's the foundation. But here's Lisangola's critical move. He says this recognition, vital as it is, should be the beginning of our analysis, not its conclusion. Now, this is where he pivots. He brings in the often overlooked, sometimes deliberately ignored, role of internal actors in keeping these cycles going. He's asking us to look not just at who's taking the resources, but how they're allowed to be taken, and who might be facilitating that from within.
It's an uncomfortable but absolutely essential pivot. Because if you connect the dots, it suggests that even when powerful external forces are at play, it's often internal decisions, weak institutions, or deliberately undermined systems that create the openings for exploitation to flourish. Lisangola doesn't hold back. He gives concrete, frankly infuriating examples. Millions, sometimes billions, meant for public infrastructure roads, power, hospitals just vanishing into private pockets, hospitals budgeted for but never built, schools falling apart while the kids of the officials in charge are studying overseas, often in the West, ironically.
And these aren't just anecdotes, are they? He's describing a pattern, a systemic issue in some places. His conclusion is blunt. These are not direct actions of Western powers, but choices made by African leaders, enabled by African systems, and too often accepted by African populations.
That's a challenging statement. It shifts a significant part of the focus onto internal agency, internal accountability. It absolutely is. And it forces that difficult question. How do these internal actions, maybe not causing the initial foreign interest, but certainly enabling the extraction, create the vulnerabilities? When accountability disappears, when institutions are weak or corrupt, it's like leaving the door wide open for external actors to come in and operate with impunity, often with help from local elites. And the long-term damage to trust between people and their leaders, it's immense. It creates cynicism, disengagement, which makes accountability even harder. It becomes this vicious cycle, trapping nations. And it creates exactly that slow death of dreams Mbembe talked about, making migration seem like the only escape.
Which then connects to another puzzle Lisangola highlights, the electoral paradox. This is that really strange dynamic you see in many African nations. People suffering under clearly poor governance, yet come election time. They often vote along tribal or ethnic lines, not based on policy or competence or track record. It's perplexing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because the negative results of those choices directly affect their own lives.
It is perplexing, especially if you look at it purely through a lens of rational choice theory in politics. Now, the standard explanations are familiar. Blaming colonial powers for creating or worsening tribal divides the divide and rule tactic. Or blaming low education levels hindering critical political thought. And those points have weight, historically speaking.
Yeah. Lisangola acknowledges these explanations are partially true. There's a legacy there, for sure. But he argues they don't complete the circle of responsibility. He pushes back against stopping the analysis at external factors. He asks some really pointed questions that bring it right back to individual and collective choices now.
Exactly, and they're quite challenging questions. He asks, for instance, when a university-educated individual chooses to promote a candidate solely based on personal connection rather than political competency, can we truly blame colonial heritage? That's sharp, because education is supposed to equip you for critical thinking beyond just loyalty, right? And he pushes further. When communities consistently prioritize ethnic loyalty over governance capability, at what point do we acknowledge the role of personal and collective choice? It raises this fundamental question about how effective democracy can even be if the core choices aren't driven by policy or competence, but by these other factors. It suggests that even with the right to vote, the quality of that choice can be undermined by these deep-seated social dynamics.
That's a really powerful challenge. It makes us consider the active role people play in their own political outcomes, even within these tangled histories. It's not saying the history doesn't matter, but asking where present-day choices are reinforcing those old divides. It's about how history lives on in current actions.
Absolutely. And the implications for democratic growth, for real accountability, are huge. If leadership selection is mainly about ethnicity or kinship, not about ability to deliver, then the whole system of checks and balances gets shaky. It can create this loop where ineffective or corrupt leaders stay in power just by playing on those loyalties, which then leads to worse governance, less development. It makes genuine progress based on merit incredibly hard. It's a real tension between traditional loyalties and modern democratic ideals.
It really is. And maybe it's a question for all of us, right? How do our own biases, our own loyalties affect our choices, even when we know better? It's a human thing. Okay, let's pivot to what might be the most glaring contradiction Lisangola discusses, the international community paradox.
Yeah.
This is where he says, the rhetoric really bumps up against reality in a very uncomfortable way. It's this pattern, the same voices loudly condemning Western interference, imperialism. Then, when a crisis hits at home, they often turn to those exact same Western institutions for help.
This needs a really close, honest look, because Lisangola argues it reveals something deep about the state of African leadership and, well, sovereignty itself. You see this pattern again and again. Leaders, public figures, intellectuals spending years rightly criticizing Western influence, the IMF, the World Bank, calling for African solutions for African problems. But then a coup happens, or a disputed election boils over, or a humanitarian crisis erupts, and suddenly appeals go out to the UN Security Council, the EU, maybe former colonial powers asking for intervention, peacekeepers, aid.
And Lisangola doesn't just call it hypocrisy, though it looks like that on the surface. He sees it as something deeper, a symptom of a more profound failure of African institutional development. It suggests an inability in those moments to rely on strong internal mechanisms for resolving conflict, ensuring stability, managing the economy, which ironically leads back to dependence on the very external powers being criticized, right when self-reliance is supposedly the goal.
And the contradiction gets even sharper when you look at money flows, illicit finance. The source points out this deep paradox. The same Western nations, often criticized for exploitation, are also the preferred safe havens for stolen African wealth. George Ayadi, the political scientist, puts a number on it, estimating maybe 80% of illicit financial flows from Africa end up in Western banks and financial institutions. That statistic just exposes this massive hypocrisy in the West, right? Rejecting desperate migrants but welcoming dirty money with open arms.
80%, that's staggering, the scale of wealth leaving the continent that way. But Lisangola characteristically pushes deeper. He accepts Ayadi's point, the Western hypocrisy is real, but he says focusing only on that often serves to deflect from a more crucial question. Why do African leaders consistently choose to store their wealth in the very systems they publicly condemn?
Yeah.
That's a profoundly uncomfortable question. Does it signal a lack of trust in their own systems? Or is it a deliberate move to keep wealth beyond reach?
It really is the core question there. This whole paradox, especially around money, shows this tangled web, external systems and internal choices feeding off each other. And it fundamentally undermines any notion of real self-reliance or economic sovereignty. It forces you to ask, what does it say about the strength, the transparency, the trustworthiness of African financial institutions if leaders themselves prefer banks in London, Paris, or Geneva? Even while denouncing those places politically, it suggests either a deep lack of faith in their own national systems or, more cynically, a strategy to shield assets from scrutiny at home. It's not just about sovereignty. It challenges the basic social contract between rulers and the ruled.
Definitely. A huge gap between the talk and the walk sometimes. Okay, let's broaden our lens now, this next part. It really gets interesting and might genuinely shift how you think about history and maybe Africa's challenges within that bigger picture. Lisangola asks us to reconsider the very idea of peace. Often, modern Pan-Africanist thought frames Africa's issues, mainly against the backdrop of colonialism. Important, yes. But Lisangola says, hang on, let's zoom out. Let's look at all the human history. And when you do that, something striking emerges. Organized international peace, the institutions we kind of rely on now, they're incredibly recent, absolute historical blip.
This is such a crucial piece of perspective. It really grounds the whole discussion. Think about it. If you take a 6,000-year view of human history, like some religious texts do, the time since we started having things like the League of Nations or the UN, it's about 0.0006% of that time. Tiny. Now, if you take the evolutionary view, humans around for maybe 200,000 years, the percentage becomes minuscule, 0.00000006%, practically nothing. Liesengola's point is stark. This mathematical reality forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. What we consider normal in terms of international cooperation and peaceful conflict resolution is, in fact, a historical anomaly of the highest order.
Well, okay, yeah. That really does put it differently. So peace, cooperation between nations, international norms. These things we often assume are the default. They're actually fragile recent inventions, hard-won achievements. It echoes Thomas Hobbes, right, the 17th century philosopher. He argued the natural human state leans towards conflict, war of all against all, unless strong institutions keep order. And that wasn't just theory. It reflected how things mostly were for millennia before our modern era.
Exactly. And applying that Hobbesian view to modern Africa has huge implications. If peace and cooperation aren't the natural state, but are anomalies we have to actively build and maintain, then the responsibility for doing that, for building strong internal institutions, becomes incredibly serious, especially for nations striving for self-determination. It means you can't just appeal to international norms while failing to build robust systems at home for justice, for governance, for managing resources fairly. The very newness of these peace mechanisms shows how fragile they are. They need constant, active work from within, not just passive reliance on the outside world. If peace is manufactured, not given, then building strong internal institutions isn't just nice to have, it's essential for survival, for prosperity.
And this historical view also reframes how we see exploitation, doesn't it? Lisangola suggests that when foreign powers exploit resources, they're not inventing new forms of exploitation. They're simply following ancient patterns of human behavior, power dynamics playing out. Now, that doesn't make it right, not at all. But it means the truly revolutionary act isn't just naming the exploitation, which is ancient. It's building systems strong enough to resist it, regulate it, and channel resources for the benefit of your own people.
Which leads perfectly to that insight from Olufang Taiwo, the Nigerian scholar. He puts it so pragmatically. He says, the question isn't whether others will attempt to exploit Africa's resources, history suggests they will, but whether we will build institutions robust enough to ensure these resources benefit African populations. That just flips the whole script, doesn't it? From pure victimhood to proactive agency. It puts the onus squarely on internal capacity building. It's about taking control of the mechanisms that matter.
So yes, colonialism was devastating. Never forget that. But seeing it in isolation from this much longer history of power and exploitation, it can lead to simplistic answers. The real challenge isn't just identifying past wrongs, it's recognizing that building peace and prosperity means actively fighting against this ancient human tendency towards conflict and exploitation. Again, not excusing anything, but understanding the deep forces you're up against and countering them with internal strength.
Precisely. And the implication is profound. It means waiting for goodwill from others or just making moral appeals while important isn't enough. If the historical norm is competition, maybe conflict, then building strong, independent, resilient internal institutions, democratic, economic, judicial, it's not just desirable, it's existentially necessary. That understanding should shape everything: resource deals, education, diplomacy, governance structures. It boils down to internal strength is the best defense.
Yeah. How does that deep history change how you think about responsibility for peace, for development? Not just in Africa, but anywhere. It makes you realize how much work goes into just keeping things stable. Let's bring it back to something concrete and foundational: education. This, too, Lisangola argues, has layers beyond just blaming external factors. He looks at the state of education in many African nations and argues that often its inadequacy stems directly from internal policy choices, not just external constraints.
This is a really sensitive area, but so critical. Lisangola uses Guinea as an example. A country with significant mineral wealth, the very stuff often cited as being externally exploited. Yet its education budget is consistently among the lowest in West Africa. He argues this isn't because some Western power forced them to underfund schools. It's a result of internal choices, internal priorities. The resources exist. The political will or priority doesn't seem to.
And Professor Mahmoud Mamdani from Makerere University offers a really powerful and honestly quite disturbing explanation for this. He says, quote, "The tragedy of post-colonial African education isn't just its inadequacy, but the deliberate nature of its inadequacy." Deliberate nature. That hits hard. Mamdani argues some governments keep education poor, not because they lack money, but because an educated population is seen as a threat to unaccountable rule.
That's a profoundly challenging insight from Mamdani, and deeply uncomfortable. It suggests a conscious strategy undermine public education to maintain power. Because, let's face it, a population that isn't well educated is less likely to question authority, less able to demand accountability, less equipped to understand complex issues. So it becomes a choice, a cynical calculation, with devastating long-term costs for the nation's development, its human potential, its real sovereignty. When you sacrifice the future of the youth for short-term power, it says everything about leadership priorities.
And you see this manifest in really stark hypocritical ways, like in the DRC again. Political leaders loudly denouncing Western influence, but sending their own kids to expensive schools in the West. While back home, the public education system they oversee is deliberately underfunded, often collapsing. Lisa Ngola's conclusion is sharp. This isn't colonial imposition, it's a conscious strategy of domestic power maintenance. The gap between words and actions is huge.
It absolutely raises fundamental questions about commitment to the future. If the very people who should champion education are undermining it for political gain, it creates this self-perpetuating cycle of underdevelopment that's incredibly hard to break. It's more than neglect. It's a betrayal of the next generation. And it fuels cynicism, erodes trust. Plus, it cripples the nation's ability to innovate, build industries, compete globally. You can't do that without educated people.
Definitely not. And it makes you think, doesn't it? How does prioritizing power over progress, especially in education, play out elsewhere? What does it really cost a society? It's not just about external resources, but internal choices with what you have. Okay, so we've navigated some really complex, sometimes difficult ideas. Where does this leave us? What's the path forward? Lisa Ngola offers a framework he calls dual responsibility thinking, and this feels really constructive. Crucially, it's not about letting the West off the hook for historical crimes or ongoing exploitation. That's not the point at all. Rather, it's about recognizing that real empowerment, real progress, comes from focusing energy on what you can control and change internally, even while acknowledging those external pressures.
That's such a key distinction. It moves beyond blame, which can be paralyzing. It's about holding both realities in view, the external pressures, the history, and the internal agency, the internal levers for change, but strategically shifting the primary focus, the main effort, towards internal action. It's pragmatic. It asks, given the situation, what's in our power?
Exactly. And Lisa Ngola uses the resource curse narrative as a great example of this thinking. We know it's true. Foreign interests often exploit African resources. Wealth flows out, locals suffer. That narrative is often valid. But Lisa Ngola adds the crucial nuance. The actual mechanism of this exploitation, quote, invariably requires local collaboration.
Yeah.
It's rarely a purely external operation.
Yeah, that point really changes how you understand these systems. Think about Nigeria's oil. That estimated $400 billion lost to corruption since independence. It wasn't just foreign companies taking it. Lisa Ngola and others like Dembi Samoyo argue it was facilitated by local actors officials, business people enabled by weak or corrupt local institutions, often hidden with local help. Moyo puts it bluntly. The resource curse in Africa isn't primarily about foreign exploitation. It's about the intersection of external interests with internal governance failures.
That forces a much more sophisticated view.
Right.
It's not just big foreign companies swooping in. It's often complex networks, partnerships between external interests and internal elites, leveraging those internal weaknesses, the lack of accountability. It's a two-way street in a damaging way.
And adopting this dual responsibility requires some fundamental shifts in thinking. First, moving beyond what Ngugi wa Thiong'o called the colonial mentality of dependency. Not denying the colonial wound, but refusing to let it define all future possibilities. As Ngugi wrote, the colonial experience is a serious historical wound, but focusing solely on the wound prevents us from seeing our power to heal it, shifting focus from injury to healing capacity.
And second, embracing what Kwasi Wiredu termed conceptual decolonization. A really vital intellectual task. It means developing the rigor to analyze challenges critically without automatically blaming only external forces, building frameworks that can handle both external and internal causes at the same time without defaulting to just one side. So for you listening, what might conceptual decolonization mean in your own context, applying that dual lens to challenges you see?
That's exactly the challenge Wiredu poses, and connecting it all up, it means moving from being reactive, just responding to external stuff, to being proactive. building internal strength, strong institutions, good governance making that the primary defense, the main engine for progress, even with ongoing external pressures. It's about fostering real self-reliance, strategic agency, building resilience from within. That's where transformative change really starts.
It's a really empowering way to look at it, actually. So where does all this lead? What's the ultimate vision emerging from this analysis? It points towards a new kind of consciousness, a revitalized Pan-Africanism, what Lysengola calls a responsibility-centered Pan-Africanism.
Yes, this is really the heart of it, the constructive proposal. It envisions a movement that bravely holds two things together: a sharp awareness of history and ongoing injustices, and an equally fierce commitment to internal accountability. It deliberately rejects the extremes. Not just blaming the outside, which leads nowhere. Not just blaming the inside, which ignores real history. But embracing the complex truth. Challenges and solutions involve both external realities and internal choices. Addressing both is key.
That's a tough balance, needs real intellectual honesty.
Yeah.
And Lysengola's core insight here is powerful. The true measure of African empowerment won't be found in rhetoric against external forces, but in our capacity to build systems that work despite them. The focus shifts to tangible internal achievements.
Exactly. Imagine African nations consistently running clean, fair elections, regardless of any outside meddling attempts. Imagine African courts, banks, universities maintaining high standards of integrity, no matter the external pressures or aid conditions. Imagine African citizens routinely demanding and getting accountability from their leaders, whatever the global politics are. That, Lysengola argues, that internal capacity, that resilience, will be the real triumph of Pan-African ideology. It's a huge shift, isn't it? From maybe a position of perceived victimhood to one of proactive strength, real self-determination.
It's sovereignty built from within, not just declared. Which raises that big question for all of us. How do societies build that kind of internal strength, especially with deep historical wounds and ongoing challenges? What practical steps, what changes in thinking and policy could foster this kind of consciousness? How could it reshape Africa's place in the world, moving from needing help to leading the way? Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground today, unpacking this responsibility paradox in modern Pan-Africanism using Christian Lysengola's analysis. From the human cost of migration, through the complexities of cause and effect, electoral puzzles, international contradictions, rethinking history, the education issue. It's been quite a journey.
And throughout, the core message from Lysengola has been consistent. The most powerful way forward is embracing this dual responsibility thinking, having the courage and honesty to look inward, critically, recognizing that while external forces are real and impactful, true empowerment flows most strongly from focusing on what can be controlled and changed internally.
It brings to mind Chinua Achebe's famous line, "Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." A truth modern Pan-Africanism rightly holds dear. But Lysengola adds that challenging twist. But perhaps the more urgent task today is ensuring that the lion's historians are honest not only about the hunter's crimes, but also about the lion's choices.
That really encapsulates the challenge, doesn't it? It's about moving beyond only asking what has been done to us, which is vital historically, but can feel disempowering. Moving towards asking the more active, empowering question, what are we doing with what remains in our control? And let's be clear again, this isn't about forgetting history or excusing past wrongs. It's about making a conscious, strategic choice about where to invest energy now, where agency lies.
The future, Lysengola suggests, belongs not to those who just denounce external forces most loudly, but to those who can most effectively build, govern, and thrive despite them. And that's the challenge, maybe for this generation. Acknowledge the wounds, but refuse to be defined by them. Recognize limitations, but refuse to be constrained. Understand history, but refuse to be imprisoned by it. It's a call to proactive growth. Wow. A really deep, thought-provoking dive today. I hope this conversation has given you, our listener, plenty to think about, maybe spark some new questions, offered some different ways to look at these critical issues. Thanks so much for joining us on the deep dive. We definitely encourage you to continue exploring these vital ideas and the power of honest self-reflection.